Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The year is 1943, and tonight I bring you a tale that unfolded on the rocky shores of New England, where the Atlantic Ocean meets the jagged coastline in an eternal dance of power and mystery. This is a story of secrets buried deeper than the ocean floor, of a man who kept the light burning not just for ships at sea, but for the shadows of his own past. Picture, if you will, Beacon Point Lighthouse. Standing 70 feet above the churning waters, its white tower has guided vessels safely to harbor for nearly a century. The lighthouse sits on a wind-swept promontory, surrounded by granite cliffs that have withstood countless storms. On clear days, you can see for miles in every direction. On foggy nights, the world shrinks to just the beacon's reach, and beyond that, nothing but darkness and the endless sound of waves crashing against stone. Thomas Whitmore had been the keeper of this lighthouse for 12 years when our story begins. A man of 62, with weathered hands and steel-gray hair, he was known throughout the nearby fishing village of Millbrook Harbor as a reliable, if solitary, figure. Every evening, without fail, the light would begin its rotation at sunset. Every morning the villagers would see smoke rising from the lighthouse cottage chimney, proof that Thomas was still there, still keeping his vigilant watch. But on the morning of October 15, 1943, something was different. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the postmistress of Millbrook Harbor, squinted through her kitchen window as she prepared her morning coffee. The lighthouse beam had operated normally through the night. She had seen it sweep across her bedroom wall every 20 seconds, as usual. Yet now, in the pale morning light, there was no smoke rising from Thomas Whitmore's chimney. This might seem like a small thing to those unfamiliar with the rhythms of lighthouse keeping. But Mrs. Hartwell had delivered mail to that cottage twice a week for over a decade. Thomas Whitmore was a creature of absolute habit. His morning fire was as dependable as the tide itself. The October wind carried the salt spray higher than usual that morning, and thick clouds gathered on the horizon, promising a storm by evening. Mrs. Hartwell felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She walked to her telephone, an old black device that connected Millbrook Harbor to the outside world, and rang the lighthouse. The phone rang 20 times before she finally replaced the receiver. By noon, word had spread through the village with the swift efficiency that only small towns possess. Young Jimmy Patterson, who delivered groceries to the lighthouse every Tuesday, confirmed that he had made his regular delivery just 2 days earlier. Thomas had seemed perfectly normal, perhaps a bit more quiet than usual, but then again, lighthouse keepers were not known for their chattiness. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the village's only physician, volunteered to make the treacherous climb up the coastal path to check on the lighthouse keeper. The doctor was a man of science, not given to flights of fancy, but he later admitted that something about that day felt wrong from the very beginning. The seabirds, normally vocal and active, seemed unusually quiet. Even the sound of the waves against the cliff seemed muffled, as though the very air itself was holding its breath. The path to Beacon Point Lighthouse was not for the faint of heart. It wound up the cliff face in a series of switchbacks, each turn revealing a more dramatic view of the ocean below, and a more precarious position for the climber. Dr. Morrison made this journey carefully, his medical bag in one hand and a walking stick in the other. As he climbed higher, the wind grew stronger, whipping his coat around him and making conversation impossible, even if there had been anyone to speak with. When he finally reached the lighthouse grounds, Dr. Morrison paused to catch his breath. The cottage appeared normal from the outside, neat, well-maintained, with Thomas's small garden still showing signs of recent care. The lighthouse itself stood as solid and dependable as ever, its lens, housing gleaming in the afternoon sun. But the silence was profound. No movement behind the cottage windows. No sound from within. Dr. Morrison knocked on the cottage door. The sound echoed strangely in the still air. He waited, then knocked again, harder this time. When there was still no response, he tried the door handle. It turned easily in his grip. Thomas never locked his door during the day. The cottage interior told a story of interrupted routine. A half-eaten breakfast sat on the kitchen table, eggs grown cold, coffee in a cup with a thin film across the surface. The morning newspaper lay folded beside the plate, open to a story about the war in Europe. A pair of reading glasses rested atop the paper, as though Thomas had simply stepped away for a moment and would return any second to finish his meal and catch up on the day's events. But Thomas Whitmore was nowhere to be found. Dr. Morrison searched the cottage methodically. The bedroom showed signs of recent occupancy. The bed made with military precision, clothes laid out for the day. In the small sitting room, a fire had been prepared in the grate, but never lit. Books lined the walls, mostly technical manuals about lighthouse operations, but also volumes of poetry and maritime history. Everything suggested a man who had planned to go about his normal day. The only unusual thing Dr. Morrison found was in Thomas's desk drawer. Among the usual papers, supply orders, weather reports, correspondence with the Lighthouse service, was a letter that had never been sent. The envelope was addressed to someone named Margaret Whitmore in Boston, with the notation, "Personal and confidential," written in Thomas's careful script. The letter itself was still sealed inside, suggesting Thomas had written it, but couldn't bring himself to mail it. Dr. Morrison climbed the spiral staircase to the lighthouse lamp room. The massive Fresnel lens dominated the circular space, its prisms catching and fracturing the afternoon light into rainbow patterns on the walls. The logbook lay open on the small desk, where Thomas recorded weather conditions, ship sightings, and equipment maintenance. The last entry was dated October 14th, yesterday, and noted only clear skies, calm seas, light operational. But it was what Dr. Morrison saw from the lamp room windows that made him catch his breath. Far below, on the rocky shore at the base of the lighthouse, something dark lay among the boulders where the tide had recently receded. From this height, it was impossible to tell what it was, but the shape was wrong for driftwood or seaweed. Dr. Morrison's heart began to beat faster as he realized he would have to make the dangerous descent to the shoreline to investigate. The path down to the base of the lighthouse was even more treacherous than the climb up from the village. It was really nothing more than handholds and footholds carved into the cliff face generations ago, meant to be used only in emergencies. As Dr. Morrison carefully picked his way down, the object on the rocks below became clearer. It was Thomas Whitmore's oil-stained work jacket, the one he wore when maintaining the lighthouse equipment. But Thomas himself was still nowhere to be seen. Standing on the rocky shore, with waves crashing around his feet and spray stinging his face, Dr. Morrison examined the jacket carefully. There was no damage to it, no tears or stains beyond the usual wear of hard work. It lay draped over a boulder, as though it had been carefully placed there, not washed up by the tide or blown by the wind. Most puzzling of all, the jacket was completely dry. The doctor spent another hour searching the shoreline, calling Thomas's name over the sound of the waves. He found nothing else. No footprints in the sand between the rocks, no other clothing, no signs of a struggle or accident. It was as though Thomas Whitmore had simply vanished, leaving behind only his jacket as a mysterious calling card. As the afternoon wore on and storm clouds gathered more thickly overhead, Dr. Morrison climbed back up to the cottage to use Thomas's telephone to contact the authorities. But before he could place the call, he made one more discovery that changed everything. In his haste to search for Thomas, Dr. Morrison had overlooked something obvious. The cottage had 2 bedrooms, and he had only checked one. The second bedroom, which Thomas used as a storage room, had its door closed. When Dr. Morrison opened it, he found himself looking at something that made no sense at all. Hewo. The room was filled with radio equipment. Not the simple ship-to-shore radio that every lighthouse keeper was issued, but sophisticated broadcasting and receiving apparatus that looked more at home in a military installation than in a lighthouse cottage. Cables ran along the walls and ceiling, leading to what appeared to be a powerful antenna system. Papers covered a makeshift desk. Not lighthouse logs, but coded messages, frequency charts, and what looked like transmission schedules. Dr. Morrison was an educated man, well-read and aware of current events. He recognized immediately that he was looking at some kind of intelligence operation. In October of 1943, with German U-boats prowling the Atlantic coast and the outcome of the war still very much in doubt, such discoveries carried tremendous implications. His hands shaking slightly, Dr. Morrison picked up one of the papers from the desk. It was a message log, with dates and times stretching back several months. The entries were in some kind of code, but the times and frequencies were clear enough. According to the log, transmissions had been made almost every night, always between midnight and 3 in the morning, always on frequencies that no legitimate lighthouse operation would ever use. Suddenly, Thomas Whitmore's disappearance took on an entirely different character. This was no longer a simple case of a lighthouse keeper who might have had an accident or taken ill. This was a matter of national security, of espionage, of secrets that could affect the lives of thousands of sailors and soldiers. Dr. Morrison's medical training had taught him to remain calm in crisis situations, but as he stood in that hidden radio room, listening to the wind howling around the lighthouse and the waves crashing against the rocks below, he felt a chill that went deeper than any ocean storm could create. He was looking at evidence that Thomas Whitmore, the quiet, dependable lighthouse keeper whom everyone in Millbrook Harbor had trusted for over a decade, had been living a double life. The question that hammered in Dr. Morrison's mind was simple but terrifying. Which side had Thomas Whitmore been working for? Before Dr. Morrison could process this discovery fully, he heard something that made his blood freeze. Footsteps on the cottage's front porch. Slow, deliberate footsteps, as though someone was trying not to be heard. Dr. Morrison quickly shut off the light in the radio room and closed the door as quietly as possible. Through the cottage's main room, he could see a shadow moving past the front window. The front door, which Dr. Morrison had left open, creaked as someone entered the cottage. From his hiding place in the hallway, the doctor could hear careful footsteps moving through the kitchen, pausing at the half-eaten breakfast, then continuing toward the sitting room. Whoever had entered was searching for something or someone. Dr. Morrison's mind raced. Should he reveal himself? Should he try to escape through the back door? Should he attempt to see who the intruder was? His medical bag felt suddenly heavy in his hand, its familiar weight offering little comfort in this unexpected situation. The footsteps stopped. The cottage fell silent except for the wind outside and the distant crash of waves. Dr. Morrison held his breath, straining to hear any sound that might indicate where the intruder had gone or what they were doing. Seconds stretched into minutes, and still nothing. Finally, Dr. Morrison gathered his courage and peered around the corner into the main room. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then, sitting calmly in Thomas's favorite chair as though he belonged there, was Thomas Whitmore himself. But this was not the Thomas Whitmore that Dr. Morrison knew. Gone was the familiar work clothes and weather-beaten appearance of a lighthouse keeper. Instead, Thomas wore a dark suit that fit him perfectly, and his usually unkempt hair was neatly combed. Most startling of all was his expression, alert, calculating, and completely without the gentle demeanor that had characterized him for 12 years in Millbrook Harbor. "Dr. Morrison," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that the village doctor had never heard before. "I wondered when someone would come looking for me. I'm sorry you had to be the one to make this discovery." Dr. Morrison stepped into the room, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hand. "Thomas, where have you been? The whole village has been worried about you?" "We thought something terrible had happened." Thomas smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. "Something terrible has happened, Doctor, but not what you think." He gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Please, sit down. There are things you need to understand before we proceed." Against his better judgment, Dr. Morrison sat down. Thomas studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "You've seen the radio equipment, haven't you?" "Of course you have. You're too thorough a man to have missed it. I suppose you're wondering whether I'm a German spy, feeding U-boat positions to enemy submarines, helping them sink American ships and kill American sailors." Dr. Morrison nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "The truth," Thomas continued, "is both more complicated and more simple than that. I am indeed a spy, Doctor, but I'm an American spy. I've been working for the Office of Strategic Services for the past 2 years, using this lighthouse as a listening post to monitor German submarine communications along the Atlantic coast." The revelation hit Dr. Morrison like a physical blow. Everything he had assumed about Thomas's disappearance, about the radio equipment, about the implications for national security, suddenly shifted into a different pattern. "The Germans have been using a code they believe is unbreakable," Thomas explained. "They transmit orders to their submarine commanders, coordinate attacks on shipping convoys, and report their positions back to headquarters. But we broke their code 6 months ago. Every message they send, we intercept and decode. Every submarine position they report, we relay to our destroyer squadrons and bomber commands." Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. "Do you know how many ships we've saved, Doctor? How many lives have been preserved because of the intelligence gathered in this room? The estimate is over 200 vessels and nearly 8,000 sailors and merchant marines." Dr. Morrison found his voice at last. "But why the disappearance? Why let the whole village think something had happened to you?" Thomas turned back from the window, and for the first time Dr. Morrison saw something like regret in his expression. "Because my cover has been compromised. German intelligence has identified this lighthouse as a source of intercepted communications. They don't know exactly how we're doing it or who's responsible, but they know enough to be dangerous." Thomas walked to his desk and picked up the unsealed letter that Dr. Morrison had noticed earlier. "This letter is to my sister Margaret. She's the only family I have left. I was trying to find a way to tell her that Thomas Whitmore, lighthouse keeper, would have to die so that Thomas Whitmore, intelligence operative, could continue his work elsewhere." The full scope of Thomas's sacrifice began to dawn on Dr. Morrison. For 2 years this man had lived a double life, maintaining his cover as a simple lighthouse keeper while conducting some of the most sensitive intelligence work of the war. He had formed friendships in the village, knowing they would have to be abandoned. He had built a life that he would have to leave behind without explanation or goodbye. "What happens now?" Dr. Morrison asked. "Now," Thomas said, "you have a choice to make, Doctor. You can report what you found here to the local authorities, who will eventually contact the federal investigators, who will determine that Thomas Whitmore was a loyal American, doing his duty for his country. The official story will be that I died in an accident, fell from the rocks, was swept out to sea, body never recovered. The village will mourn, and in a few weeks, a new lighthouse keeper will arrive to take my place." Thomas paused, studying Dr. Morrison's face carefully. "Or you can forget what you've discovered here. You can report that you found no trace of Thomas Whitmore except his jacket on the rocks below. You can let the village reach its own conclusions about what happened. And you can allow Thomas Whitmore to continue his work for as long as the war requires it." Dr. Morrison sat in silence, weighing the implications of Thomas's words. Outside, the storm that had been building all day finally arrived in earnest. Rain lashed against the cottage windows, and the wind howled around the lighthouse tower. The beam continued its steady rotation, just as it had for nearly a century, cutting through the darkness and storm to guide ships safely to harbor. "If I choose to forget what I found here," Dr. Morrison said slowly, "what guarantee do I have that you are who you say you are? What proof do you have that you're working for American intelligence rather than against it?" Thomas reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather folder. He handed it to Dr. Morrison without a word. Inside were credentials identifying Thomas Whitmore as an operative of the Office of Strategic Services, along with authorizations signed by officials whose names Dr. Morrison recognized from newspaper reports about the war effort. "These could be forged," Dr. Morrison observed. "They could be," quote, Thomas agreed. "But consider this, Doctor. If I were a German agent, would I have revealed myself to you at all? Wouldn't it have been simpler to let you report my disappearance? allow the official investigation to conclude that I had died accidentally, and then continue my operations under a new identity. By showing myself to you, by explaining what I've been doing, I'm placing my life and my mission in your hands." Dr. Morrison studied Thomas's face, looking for any sign of deception. What he saw instead was a man carrying the weight of terrible responsibility. The jovial lighthouse keeper he had known for 12 years had been real, but it had also been a carefully constructed facade. Underneath was someone who had sacrificed his identity, his relationships, and his peace of mind for something he believed was more important than his personal happiness. "There's something else you should know," Thomas said quietly. "The intelligence we've been gathering here isn't just about protecting American ships. We've learned that the Germans are planning something significant, a major offensive that could change the course of the war. The details are still unclear, but our intercepted communications suggest it will happen within the next few months." Thomas walked to the window again, watching the lighthouse beams sweep across the storm-tossed waters. The work being done here may be crucial to preventing that offensive from succeeding. That's why I can't simply disappear permanently. That's why Thomas Whitmore, lighthouse keeper, needs to die so that the mission can continue elsewhere. Dr. Morrison made his decision. "What do you need me to do?" Thomas turned back with an expression of profound relief. "Return to the village. Report that you found no sign of me except my jacket on the rocks. Tell them the storm has made further searching impossible, but that you fear the worst. In a few days, when the weather clears, a Coast Guard cutter will arrive to conduct an official search. They won't find anything, of course. Thomas Whitmore will be declared lost at sea. And then a new lighthouse keeper will arrive. His name will be Samuel Fletcher, and he'll be a quiet man who keeps to himself, much like Thomas Whitmore did. The villagers will think it's a coincidence that another solitary lighthouse keeper has been assigned to Beacon Point. They won't realize that Samuel Fletcher and Thomas Whitmore are the same person, with a new identity and new papers, continuing the same vital work." Dr. Morrison stood to leave, then paused. "The letter to your sister, what will you tell her?" Thomas picked up the envelope and held it for a moment before placing it carefully in the fireplace. "I'll tell her that Thomas Whitmore died a hero, even if she never knows the details of how or why. It's not the whole truth, but it's true enough." As Dr. Morrison prepared to make his way back down the treacherous cliff path in the storm, Thomas stopped him with one final revelation. "Doctor, there's something I want you to know. These past 12 years in Millbrook Harbor haven't been entirely a pretense. The friendships I've made, the life I've built, those were real, even if they were built on a foundation of necessary deception." Thomas looked around the cottage that had been his home, his workspace, and his hiding place. "When this war is over, when the world is safe again, I hope Thomas Whitmore can come back to life. I hope he can return to this lighthouse, to this village, to the simple pleasure of keeping ships safe, without having to worry about codes and enemy agents and the weight of other people's lives on his shoulders." Dr. Morrison nodded, understanding. "And if he can't, then at least he'll have done something that mattered," Thomas replied. "At least he'll have helped ensure that there's a world worth coming back to." Dr. Morrison's journey back to Millbrook Harbor through the storm was treacherous and exhausting, but it gave him time to process everything he had learned and to prepare for the performance he would have to give when he reached the village. He would have to convince his neighbors that he was genuinely worried about Thomas Whitmore's disappearance, that he feared the worst, that the evidence suggested a tragic accident. It would not be difficult to seem concerned. He was concerned, though not for the reasons everyone would assume. He was worried about a man who had taken on an enormous burden for his country, who had sacrificed his identity and his relationships to serve in a war that demanded such sacrifices from so many. When Dr. Morrison finally reached his own home, soaked and exhausted, he found Mrs. Hartwell waiting for him with hot coffee and anxious questions. He told her what Thomas had instructed him to say, that he had found Thomas's jacket on the rocks below the lighthouse, that the storm made further searching impossible, that he feared Thomas had suffered some kind of accident. The story spread through Millbrook Harbor with the same swift efficiency as the original news of Thomas's disappearance. By morning, despite the continuing storm, a small group of the village's most able-bodied men had volunteered to help search for any other trace of the missing lighthouse keeper. Dr. Morrison accompanied them, knowing they would find nothing but maintaining his role as a concerned neighbor and physician. 3 days later, as Thomas had predicted, a Coast Guard cutter arrived from Boston to conduct an official search. The crew spent 2 days combing the shoreline and the waters around Beacon Point, using equipment far more sophisticated than anything the villagers possessed. They found nothing. On the 5th day after Thomas's disappearance, the lighthouse beam failed to illuminate at sunset. For the first time in over a century, Beacon Point light went dark. Ships approaching Millbrook Harbor had to rely on their own navigation, and the fishing boats that normally worked the nearby waters stayed in port, rather than risk the dangerous rocks without the lighthouse's guidance. The symbolism was not lost on the villagers. Thomas Whitmore's disappearance had extinguished more than just a life. It had snuffed out a beacon that had guided their community for generations. The lighthouse stood silent and dark against the sky, a monument to loss, and a reminder of how quickly the familiar could become strange. But on the 6th day, something unexpected happened. A new lighthouse keeper arrived on the morning ferry from Boston. His name was Samuel Fletcher, and he bore such a strong resemblance to Thomas Whitmore that several villagers commented on it. Mrs. Hartwell remarked to Dr. Morrison that it was almost as though Thomas had a brother no one had known about. Samuel Fletcher moved into the lighthouse cottage that same day. By evening, the beacon was operational again, its familiar sweep returning to guide ships safely through the waters around Beacon Point. The village breathed a collective sigh of relief. Whatever tragedy had befallen Thomas Whitmore, the lighthouse would continue its essential work. Dr. Morrison watched Samuel Fletcher's first week in Millbrook Harbor with careful attention. The new lighthouse keeper was quiet and kept to himself, much like Thomas had done. He maintained the light with professional efficiency, kept detailed weather logs, and performed all the duties his position required. But he made no attempt to socialize with the villagers, or to replace Thomas Whitmore in the small community's social structure. There was something different about Samuel Fletcher, something that kept him at arm's length from the life of the village. It was as though he was always listening for something the rest of them couldn't hear, always watching for something they couldn't see. Dr. Morrison understood why, even if no one else did. The war continued, and with it came news of Allied successes that might have been influenced by intelligence gathered at Beacon Point. U-boat attacks along the New England coast decreased dramatically. Convoy losses in the North Atlantic dropped to their lowest levels since the beginning of the conflict. Ships that might have been sunk reached their destinations safely, carrying supplies and troops that helped turn the tide of the war. As the months passed, Dr. Morrison occasionally found himself wondering about the man in the lighthouse. Was Samuel Fletcher able to continue the work that Thomas Whitmore had started? Were the coded transmissions still being intercepted, decoded, and passed along to those who could use them to save lives and win battles? There were small signs that suggested the answer was yes. Sometimes, late at night, when Dr. Morrison was called out on medical emergencies, he would see unusual activity around the lighthouse. Extra lights in windows that should have been dark, the suggestion of movement that indicated someone was awake and working when they should have been sleeping. Once, during a particularly clear night, Dr. Morrison thought he saw the outline of additional antennas on the lighthouse tower, equipment that hadn't been there during Thomas Whitmore's time. But in daylight, these antennas seemed to disappear, as though they could be quickly assembled and disassembled as needed. The war in Europe moved toward its climax. The major German offensive that Thomas had warned about never materialized. Or perhaps it was prevented by intelligence that made such an offensive impossible to execute successfully. American and Allied forces pressed their advantages, and by the spring of 1945, victory seemed certain. On the day Germany surrendered, ending the war in Europe, the entire village of Millbrook Harbor gathered at the harbor to celebrate. Church bells rang, ships sounded their horns, and people embraced in the streets, with tears of joy and relief streaming down their faces. Dr. Morrison looked up at Beacon Point Lighthouse during the celebration and saw Samuel Fletcher standing in the lamp room, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Even from that distance, even knowing that Samuel Fletcher was not the same man who had disappeared more than a year earlier, Dr. Morrison could see something in the lighthouse keeper's posture that suggested profound satisfaction and relief. The mission, whatever its details had been, was complete. That evening, as the celebration continued in the village below, Dr. Morrison decided to walk up the cliff path to the lighthouse. He told himself he was making a social call on Samuel Fletcher, perhaps inviting the lighthouse keeper to join the victory celebration. But really, he was hoping for some kind of closure to the story that had begun with Thomas Whitmore's disappearance. He found Samuel Fletcher sitting on the lighthouse gallery, the narrow walkway that circled the lamp room 70 feet above the ocean. The lighthouse keeper was watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors of orange and red, and he seemed so lost in thought that he didn't notice Dr. Morrison's approach until the doctor cleared his throat. "Mr. Fletcher," Dr. Morrison said, "I thought you might like to join the celebration in the village. The war is over." Samuel Fletcher turned, and for just a moment Dr. Morrison saw something familiar in his eyes, a warmth and recognition that belonged to Thomas Whitmore, not to the careful stranger who had replaced him. "Thank you, Doctor," Samuel Fletcher replied, "but I think I'll stay here tonight." Sometimes a man needs to be alone with his thoughts, especially when something important has ended. Dr. Morrison nodded and turned to leave, but Samuel Fletcher's voice stopped him. "Doctor, I want you to know that what we discussed that night during the storm, it made a difference. It made all the difference." It was the closest thing to a direct acknowledgement that Dr. Morrison would ever receive, but it was enough. He walked back down the cliff path, knowing that his decision to keep Thomas Whitmore's secret had been the right one, that lives had been saved and battles had been won, because one village doctor had chosen to trust a man who had sacrificed everything for something greater than himself. The lighthouse beam resumed its rotation as darkness fell, just as it had every night for over a century. Ships approaching Millbrook Harbor saw its light and adjusted their courses accordingly, never knowing that the beacon that guided them had also served as a guardian against enemies they would never see and threats they would never know existed. Samuel Fletcher remained at Beacon Point Lighthouse for 3 more months after the war ended. During that time, he seemed to gradually become more like the Thomas Whitmore that the village had known, more friendly, more willing to engage in casual conversation, more integrated into the small community's daily life. Then, one morning in late August, the villagers woke to find the lighthouse dark again. But this time, there was no mystery, no disappearance, no abandoned breakfast or jacket left on the rocks. Samuel Fletcher had simply left, taking his few possessions with him, and leaving behind a note explaining that he had accepted a position at a lighthouse in California, where the weather was warmer and the isolation more complete. The note thanked the people of Millbrook Harbor for their kindness and hospitality. It expressed the hope that whoever replaced him would find the same satisfaction in keeping the light that Samuel Fletcher had found during his time there. A week later, a new lighthouse keeper arrived, a young man named Robert Chen, recently discharged from the Navy, who was genuinely what Samuel Fletcher had only pretended to be, a simple lighthouse keeper with no secrets, no hidden mission, no double life to maintain. The war in Europe moved toward its climax. The major German offensive that Thomas had warned about never materialized. Or perhaps it was prevented by intelligence that made such an offensive impossible to execute successfully. American and Allied forces pressed their advantages, and by the spring of 1945, victory seemed certain. On the day Germany surrendered, ending the war in Europe, the entire village of Millbrook Harbor gathered at the harbor to celebrate. Church bells rang, ships sounded their horns, and people embraced in the streets, with tears of joy and relief streaming down their faces. Dr. Morrison looked up at Beacon Point Lighthouse during the celebration and saw Samuel Fletcher standing in the lamp room, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Even from that distance, even knowing that Samuel Fletcher was not the same man who had disappeared more than a year earlier, Dr. Morrison could see something in the lighthouse keeper's posture that suggested profound satisfaction and relief. The mission, whatever its details had been, was complete. That evening, as the celebration continued in the village below, Dr. Morrison decided to walk up the cliff path to the lighthouse. He told himself he was making a social call on Samuel Fletcher, perhaps inviting the lighthouse keeper to join the victory celebration. But really, he was hoping for some kind of closure to the story that had begun with Thomas Whitmore's disappearance. He found Samuel Fletcher sitting on the lighthouse gallery, the narrow walkway that circled the lamp room 70 feet above the ocean. The lighthouse keeper was watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors of orange and red, and he seemed so lost in thought that he didn't notice Dr. Morrison's approach until the doctor cleared his throat. "Mr. Fletcher," Dr. Morrison said, "I thought you might like to join the celebration in the village. The war is over." Samuel Fletcher turned, and for just a moment Dr. Morrison saw something familiar in his eyes, a warmth and recognition that belonged to Thomas Whitmore, not to the careful stranger who had replaced him. "Thank you, Doctor," Samuel Fletcher replied, "but I think I'll stay here tonight." Sometimes a man needs to be alone with his thoughts, especially when something important has ended. Dr. Morrison nodded and turned to leave, but Samuel Fletcher's voice stopped him. "Doctor, I want you to know that what we discussed that night during the storm, it made a difference. It made all the difference." It was the closest thing to a direct acknowledgement that Dr. Morrison would ever receive, but it was enough. He walked back down the cliff path, knowing that his decision to keep Thomas Whitmore's secret had been the right one, that lives had been saved and battles had been won, because one village doctor had chosen to trust a man who had sacrificed everything for something greater than himself. The lighthouse beam resumed its rotation as darkness fell, just as it had every night for over a century. Ships approaching Millbrook Harbor saw its light and adjusted their courses accordingly, never knowing that the beacon that guided them had also served as a guardian against enemies they would never see and threats they would never know existed. Samuel Fletcher remained at Beacon Point Lighthouse for 3 more months after the war ended. During that time, he seemed to gradually become more like the Thomas Whitmore that the village had known, more friendly, more willing to engage in casual conversation, more integrated into the small community's daily life. Then, one morning in late August, the villagers woke to find the lighthouse dark again. But this time, there was no mystery, no disappearance, no abandoned breakfast or jacket left on the rocks. Samuel Fletcher had simply left, taking his few possessions with him, and leaving behind a note explaining that he had accepted a position at a lighthouse in California, where the weather was warmer and the isolation more complete. The note thanked the people of Millbrook Harbor for their kindness and hospitality. It expressed the hope that whoever replaced him would find the same satisfaction in keeping the light that Samuel Fletcher had found during his time there. A week later, a new lighthouse keeper arrived, a young man named Robert Chen, recently discharged from the Navy, who was genuinely what Samuel Fletcher had only pretended to be, a simple lighthouse keeper with no secrets, no hidden mission, no double life to maintain. But that is not quite the end of our story. 2 years after Samuel Fletcher's departure, Dr. Morrison received a letter postmarked from San Francisco. It was signed TW and contained only a few sentences. "The weather here is everything I hoped it would be. The lighthouse overlooks a bay that reminds me of home, and the work is satisfying in ways I had almost forgotten were possible. I wanted you to know that sometimes a man can come back to life, even when he thought he had died permanently." Enclosed with the letter was a newspaper clipping from the San Francisco Chronicle. It was an obituary for Margaret Whitmore of Boston, aged 74, who had died peacefully in her sleep. The obituary mentioned that she was survived by her brother Thomas, a lighthouse keeper in California, who had been unable to attend the funeral due to his remote location and essential duties. Dr. Morrison understood. Thomas Whitmore had indeed come back to life, at least enough to reconnect with his sister before she died. The war had ended, the mission had been completed, and the man who had sacrificed his identity for his country had found a way to reclaim at least part of what he had given up. And so we come to the end of our tale. In the years that followed, Dr. Morrison would sometimes find himself thinking about Thomas Whitmore, or Samuel Fletcher, or whatever name the lighthouse keeper was using in his new life. The doctor would wonder whether the man had found peace in his California lighthouse, whether the weight of his wartime secrets had grown lighter with the passage of time, whether he had been able to build new friendships without the burden of deception. Dr. Morrison never learned the answers to these questions. The letter from San Francisco was the last communication he ever received from the man who had once kept the light at Beacon Point. But sometimes, on clear nights when he could see the Beacon Point lights sweeping across the harbor, Dr. Morrison would remember the conversation in the Lighthouse cottage during that October storm, and he would feel a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he had played a small part in something larger and more important than the daily routines of village life. The lighthouse at Beacon Point still operates today, though it has been automated for many years and no longer requires a keeper. Ships still rely on its beacon to navigate the treacherous waters around the rocky promontory. Tourists sometimes visit to admire the view and to learn about the lighthouse's long history of guiding vessels safely to harbor. But they don't know the whole story. They don't know about Thomas Whitmore, who kept more than just the light burning during the dark years of the Second World War. They don't know about the radio equipment hidden in the cottage, the coded messages intercepted in the pre-dawn hours, the lives saved by intelligence gathered 70 feet above the churning Atlantic. Perhaps it's better that way. Perhaps some stories are meant to be kept as secrets, shared only between those who understand the weight of sacrifice and the cost of duty. Perhaps the true memorial to Thomas Whitmore is not a plaque or a monument, but the simple fact that ships continue to pass safely in the night, guided by the light he kept burning when the world's darkness seemed overwhelming and victory was far from certain. And perhaps, in some lighthouse on the California coast, an old man still watches the sunset and remembers a time when keeping the light burning was the most important thing he could do for his country and his fellow men. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our tale of Beacon Point Lighthouse and the keeper who disappeared into history so that history itself might continue to shine its light into the darkness.